Hi, folks. Welcome to another episode of Film Study. This is Ken McCusick, and we're here for the next of our position group reviews, looking at the Ravens cornerbacks from the 2024 season. Here to do that with me is Kevin Ostreicher of Locked On Ravens. Kevin, how you doing?
I'm doing as well as I can with the Ravens being eliminated. Ken, I know it was a tough way to end the year. A lot of high expectations, especially from what we saw in the second half of the season with the corners in particular. But they have a long offseason ahead in Baltimore, and I'm excited to see what they do with the roster.
Yeah, absolutely. So always disappointing. You're losing a year out of the prime of Lamar Jackson, out of a lot of other prime assembled roster situations in football is really more of the big deal here. So it definitely sucks. And the Orioles and Ravens in a similar situation in terms of losing prime years out of big time players.
Yeah, it's tough. And I think that for Baltimore, the city loves their sports teams. I love these sports teams. I know you love them too, Ken. And it's, every year you don't get a championship, it just pushes that can down the road a little bit, and it's tough to watch it.
So this is the first time in a while that the Ravens have actually looked like they were pretty solid going into the season at cornerback, particularly with the draft they had last year. Drafted two corners in the first four rounds. Nate Wiggins, of course, at number 30, and then TJ Tampa in the fourth round, who seemed to be quite a value then. Those were my first and sixth cornerbacks on the board, by the way, respectively, for my draft list. I'm very excited to forget those. The loss of Ronald Darby seemed very serious at the time. Had a big year in 23 under McDonald. He was terrible this last year, so at the end of the year. And the Rock Ya-Sin signing, is now a distant memory. Obviously, not a good signing for the Ravens. And they had Brandon Stephens, of course, coming back, which was great news.
Yeah, I think what we expected coming into the year versus what the reality was, especially in the first part, was pretty night and day. Part of that, obviously, was they re-signed Arthur Millette, and then he was out for most of the season, and there wasn't really a lot because we know Baltimore, they love to have that three outside corner rotation, the inside-outside versatility, and so that kind of forced them, with Millette being out, to pivot to a secondary plan. And then with Brandon Stephens obviously not being as good as anticipated, they had to make the move for Trey White, who had moments throughout the year for Baltimore, but obviously was not the big-time corner acquisition and the one-for-one replacement for Brandon Stephens. But, I mean, you're right, Nate Wiggins and TJ Tampa, we kind of talked about it a little bit, you and I, before the season started, of like, this positional group looks really, really good for the Ravens. And even if they have to deal with an injury or two, if Stephens continues on his trajectory, if Moreland can take another step, which we'll get into, if Nate Wiggins can be that lockdown rookie cornerback, which we'll get into, it would work. But I just think some of the negatives we saw outweighed some of those positives, especially early.
Yeah, they did for most of the season. They had enough talent to get by in the secondary. The problem really was that the safety problems had to be addressed with guys that they would have otherwise played at slot corner. And that actually degraded the corner look. So Brandon Stephens regressed in his contract year, very frequently targeted, particularly on back shoulder plays. We'll get into that, some of that. The quality of play tipped back to some youth, and I mean, maybe barbelled in a sense because Marlon Humphrey had a big comeback year. But for Nate Wiggins to have a big rookie year like he did, he outperformed expectations even as number 30 in terms of what he accomplished.
Yeah, his shutdown ability, his ability to run stride for stride with guys. And I thought that he showed a lot of physicality this year. And Nate's not one to shy away from contact. I know the frame is a little concerning when he's going in there and making those big hits. We saw a couple of times where he had to leave for a bit and then come back and had some small minor injuries he had to deal with. But I don't know where they would be without Nate Wiggins, considering the year that Brandon Stephens had. I think I don't want to say luxury, but it certainly helps the fact that they moved Brandon Stephens around a little bit as the season progressed and went on, and we saw them try him out in a couple of different roles, but they had two constants, and a big part of that was getting that production. And I know a lot of people maybe wanted to see Cooper DeJean in that spot, or a couple of other corners that maybe you could argue, could the Ravens have traded up for a guy? But it worked out. It worked out 100%.
Yeah, they for sure got the right guy. As good as Cooper DeJean is, they for sure got the right guy in Wiggins. Let's move on to some coaching things, because some things have just happened today. But last year, Denard Wilson, of course, was the coach of the secondary, and he went off to Tennessee. McDonald left, of course. That's a large element of the defensive planning of how you're going to explain the players what their roles are, how they're going to understand how they fit within the larger scheme. And it was a big loss. And, they had Chris Hewitt as the coach this year. Just on Tuesday, they signed Chuck Pagano in what I believe was a hiring over him role. Now, I can't always tell from titles, but when he's senior secondary coach or I think a senior secondary coach was what he was. To me, that says a blank secondary coach is probably beneath him. Okay, I don't know, but it was obviously a move that Hewitt didn't like. And then just before we recorded today here, of course, Chris Hewitt and the Ravens have agreed to part ways mutually.
Yeah, it kind of seemed like the writing was on the wall, and especially with the start that the unit had. And again, you mentioned it, Ken. The safety problems were a big reason why the Ravens were in the position they were in. But with Hewitt, Pagano kind of outlined how this whole opportunity came to be on the Pat McAfee show. Harbaugh called him up, said he still got an itch, he still want to get into it on a certain level, and then he comes in. And Hewitt's a guy that had defensive coordinator interviews just last season. He interviewed for Jacksonville's defensive coordinator spot. And so he's expected to have interest. And I just feel like with the way that it all went down, I was expecting, demotion, I don't think is ever really a thing that happens in today's game. Like I know a lot of people, just demote him. Just people don't want to take those demotions. So yeah, I think mutually agreeing to part ways was the right decision. They kind of want to bring back some of that old school stuff, it feels like, with Pagano and some of that mentality. So Hewitt's a guy that was there for some of that. Came in 2012, has been there for a decade plus. It's going to be it's a complete changing of the guard now. And I think it will help maybe a more consistent season secondary wise.
Wink departure was very similar. I don't know what Hewitt's contract situation was. He might have been signed through 2025, and then they just both agreed with no re-upping of that contract in sight, that, hey, we'll just cut it for last year. That's exactly what happened with Martindale when he left, was that Wink didn't want to coach on 1 year remaining on his deal, and the Ravens were okay to let him go a year early if you're going to be disinterested. So that often is when people are part ways. And that's why if Harbaugh is re-signed for the next 3 years, which I presume is coming, I don't know the term exactly, but my guess would be 3 more years for 2028, that the first chance that will really be a significant chance for him to depart will be after the 2027 season, where he has 1 year left. And then Bisciotti will have to either sign him up for a new contract, or they may just mutually part ways at that point.
Yeah, and that's the intriguing conversation here, because I know a lot of the discourse is, well, if they can't continue to get it done, and we just talked about it earlier, you're wasting a year of Lamar Jackson's prime, and is it the right guy? I'm not sitting here saying Harbaugh's a terrible coach, because he's not, but it's just like, is it time for a change? And there are multiple people on multiple different sides of that argument. We don't have to get completely into that because we're not talking about that right now, but it's interesting to see how this coaching staff is taking shape, because I know the age-old saying, Ken, is, if you're a friend of the Harbaugh family or you got connections with the Harbaugh family, they will always have a spot for you. And Pagano made it clear that he's been in contact with Harbaugh, and it all just kind of came about this way.
Well, it's a good opportunity for Pagano to keep his foot in the door and whatnot. He's not a head coaching candidate really at this point. He's 64 years old. He's already a couple of years older than Harbaugh. So he's certainly not with the Ravens, but I don't even think with anybody else. He's certainly not a dynasty coach. He's not the guy who's going to be around for 20 years coaching football at this point. So if you want a younger coach for that sort of role. Let's talk about get back to the secondary for a minute, get back to the cornerback specifically. Lots of breakdowns in the secondary early in the season. Obviously, over those first 10 weeks, there was a lot of blame being thrown away. Was Brandon Stephens just, terrible all of a sudden? A lot of people thought that Zach Orr was the reason for it. And then things became a lot more clear as we moved on, and the secondary actually flipped the light switch as soon as both Marcus Williams and Eddie Jackson were sat down.
It was very clear. And I know that a lot of teams, when you invest that much money in a safety, $70 million, some teams will just say, well, we paid the guy, might as well play him and see if it turns around. But this team over the course of the last handful of seasons has been very proactive in when something's not working, they are going to address it as soon as they can. They're not going to wait until the offseason to do it. And so, Marcus handled it like a pro. Obviously, we've learned that Eddie Jackson did not do that. Yep. To keep it there. But I still think that when we saw that change, there was a lot more confidence. You could see the confidence from the players. You could see that they were playing harder in that closed door meeting that Zach Orr had, open forum with the players and the coaching staff defensively. It did help, and it kind of helped clear the weeds a little bit of like, okay, who's really going to play for us and play hard, and who can we not afford to put on that field. But as the year went on, they got more comfortable. It wasn't about individual talent and individual performances, but when you have a bunch of individual talent, it doesn't matter if your unit isn't cohesive and playing as one. And we saw a bunch of that with some of those breakdowns early on. Obviously, moving Kyle Hamilton helped a lot as well, take some pressure off of some guys. And it was a lot of change in a short amount of time, but they handled it with awesome ability. And I thought that they really were able to turn it on that second part of the year.
Stayed with a too high shell look. What I liked about this year's team, as much at least as last year's team, maybe more, is that I think they did a good job at disguising their blitzes for as long as possible. So one thing you'll see is the slot corner in particular, when blitzing, will often creep up to the edge defender and kind of give that away too early. That gives away the hot read to the quarterback earlier. So he can actually check out of something really quickly, or usually the receiver in the slot knows immediately the ball is coming to him because that slot corner is coming. The other person who can give it away is the safety who's coming down to replace him. So if your strong safety or whichever safety is coming down to replace that cornerback, and they see that as well, of course, that gives it away as well. They did a very good job of disguising that rotation. I think that might have been part of the problem early in the season, is that Williams and maybe the corners included in this, but Williams and Jackson at the least, were not disguising that particularly well, and that was a problem.
We saw them slow play it, and even to the point where Nate Wiggins would literally not just slight jog. He would walk up to the line, and then right when that ball is snapped, didn't matter where he was, didn't matter if he wasn't there. It was that element of surprise and disguise where he would just bolt there, and quarterbacks didn't really know what to do with it. And again, the Ravens loved last season using Arthur Millette as that corner blitzer. They didn't have him for the majority of the year this year, so they had to improvise. And there are a bunch of guys on that roster that can do it. I'm not saying Arthur Millette is their only slot blitzer.
They actually had 7 sacks from slot corner last year.
It was incredible to see kind of how everybody was getting involved in that. Nate, Marlin, I mean, they used Brandon Stevens there. They were using a lot of different players. And that's one of the key staples of this Ravens defense, dating back obviously before Zach Orr, which is kind of the system that they've used internally over the years. So it's different in one thing to execute a play, but if an offense knows it's coming, they're going to be able to check at the line, like you said, and kind of combat that. So disguise ability is massive, and I thought the Ravens did a good job of that as the year went on.
Yeah. One thing that I think, I want to get to that after I talk about this. The slot corner group they had was outstanding before Millette came back. I thought Millette was going to be Wally Pipped when he got back. Turned out he came back, played a little bit, didn't play particularly well, got hurt again, and he was out for the season. So he effectively lost all of his snaps during the year. But early in the year, they had Kyle Hamilton playing extremely well on most downs, and they had Darius Washington playing extremely well on other downs, and Marlon Humphrey playing extremely well when he was in the slot because Wiggins and Stevens were both on the outside. So they had a lot of different ways that worked. But then both of those guys, both of Washington and Hamilton, of course, had to move to the back end, reducing probably each of their value. Even though Washington was a good player on the back end, I think he's an even better slot corner. They will stay probably with Washington at safety next year. But I think ideally, I think he'd be the third safety that they had and not the second. And he'd be a slot corner primarily. But we'll see. Obviously, need is gonna dictate usage. That's exactly what happened this year. But the point being in this, that they took Hamilton out of his best position and moved him to safety, and they took Washington probably out of his best position and moved him back, reducing the value of each of those players. But the addition by subtraction they got by taking Williams and Jackson was so great, it made the move worth it.
Yeah, it is addition by subtraction, and then I guess subtraction by addition in the same vein when you're talking about moving those guys back. But to me, I think the big part of how this team operated this past season was the ability for them to have so many guys in different roles, and the fact that they played them all well, like you said. And I think it gives me hope for next year because now they can kind of build around what they know is there. Where during the season, they're talking about like, oh, we're making all this change, and they're scrambling essentially and saying this is gonna have to work because there's no other way that it can. You're removing 2 guys from the lineup, you're putting 2 new guys in, but now you have a full off season to say, where Darius played really well in the slot. Do we want to bring in another safety to put next to Kyle? But wait, maybe you want to put another safety in that equation so you can move Kyle around again. It's just the versatility that this team preaches in the secondary. It was on full display this season, not out of just like, oh, we want to experiment with all this stuff and see what works. It was like, no, if this doesn't work, the year is probably a wash defensively because there are no other options.
Yeah, it was definitely the Herb Brooks comment. Great moments are born out of great opportunity from Miracle, and great opportunity is born out of complete desperation. Is more like what this was. Anyway, one thing about the Ravens that I haven't been very happy about, and this is really a corner issue they had with Stevens, and I hope this changes, is that they don't travel at all. So they like to play fixed corners, fixed sides. This has been the way, by the way, for the Ravens pretty much their entire history. They've never been a traveling team. But it is something that what it means is if you have a cornerback like Stevens in there who doesn't have a broad, levelized set of cornerback skills like a Wiggins does, then you have a guy who everybody knows where they are and they know what his weaknesses are, and they can place their receiver who addresses those weaknesses directly. So the Bills can put Keon Coleman directly over there, and you have a big-bodied back shoulder guy or Mac Hollins for that matter, who you can throw to. And every team is aware of this. It's just it's not an acceptable situation. So I think that may be something the Ravens will look to change in 2025.
Yeah, I agree. And it doesn't have to be like Revis Island where you're just traveling the same guy all over the field for the entirety of the game, but just switching it up. And you mentioned guys like Mac Hollins, Keon Coleman. The big one for me was George Pickens, who is great at flashing those late hands. And we know that Brandon Stevens, he can't get his head around for the ball. It's been an issue his entire career, the ball tracking and ball, whatever. It just hasn't been there. And so you're looking for a cue as a cornerback to, hey, when am I going to turn my head around for the ball? You're tracking the wide receiver, saying, all right, what is that cue? And if the guy's not flashing their hands or looking up for the ball, you still think the ball's in the quarterback's hands. But then all of a sudden that ball's placed right in the breadbasket, and Pickens is half a second before the ball gets there, just takes his hands out and puts it there. Brandon Stevens is looking around like, wait, when was the ball released? And so in those matchups, I think that traveling with a Pickens or a Coleman or whoever it is, because those clear weaknesses, you weren't going to throw at Marlon and Wiggins the way they were playing the entire season. And it added the other element of like, well, we know Brandon Stevens is going to be over here. It just, all of those elements combined made it that Brandon Stevens was the one that was getting picked on time and time and time again. There were full drives that we just saw teams go out there and target Brandon Stevens almost the whole way. He was giving up catches. There were penalties, this, that, and the other. So I think that whether he's back or not, and that's a different conversation, I agree with you, Ken. They're going to have to at least look into whether they want to start moving guys around a little bit more.
The phenomenon you're mentioning where they will find that guy, I call it. So it often at times has been the Ravens linebackers in the past. And even Roquan Smith did not have a bad coverage year in the second half, not have a bad coverage second half. Let's put it that way. The Ravens had some problems right off the bat. Kansas City ran a lot of rub routes in week one, a lot of picks off that 3-man bunch formation they like to run usually on the right side. And that created all kinds of problems for the inside linebackers. Mahomes, all he needs to do is see that it's working. He'll continue doing it until it doesn't. And they were very effective at that. But I thought that it's interesting. Stevens becomes the kind of weakness that you have to put the microscope on him for large periods of games. And obviously we saw some really awful things happen. In addition, one of the extra ones that I thought was really bad is the things that happened between Williams, and it's primarily Williams playing on that side of the field, between Williams and Stevens. I'm unsure about the blame, but when Hamilton starts being pissed at Stevens, as he was on the touchdown to, who was it? Van Jefferson, I think it was, against the Steelers in the playoff game. That's the kind of play it's like he's done in Baltimore. I cannot see him back. And we'll talk about it a little bit later about whether or not there's some way that he could be back, but I don't really see a path for it, to be honest.
Yeah, I don't either. And we'll get, like you said, we'll talk about it a little later, just based off, where the show goes. But it's difficult because when there are already issues with the skill set, and then, a guy can't tell if they're supposed to be safety help or not, and he lets a guy run past him, or he's not covering his zone correctly, whatever it is, can't stick with his man. All of that combined, and you're having other players getting mad. It's just like there's a clear weakness. And, you don't say that stuff lightly of like, oh, because there are other sides to the story. But when it happens that consistently, when it's been a problem, and then you just see the steep drop off, I mean, we know the player that Brandon Stevens can be. It's just, can the Ravens risk it not being that Brandon Stevens next season if they sign him to an extension, and even sinking some of their cap space into it, which again, Brandon Stevens is not going to get a minimum contract, regardless of where he goes, if it's Baltimore or somewhere else. So it's an interesting equation, but I would see the Ravens probably liking to upgrade there. And I think Eric DeCosta's comments at his end of season press conference definitely didn't inspire anyone to think that Stevens will be back.
Yeah, fairly telling. I would agree on that. Well, let's move into some of the individual corners. Marlon Humphrey returned to relative good health this year. He got off the field a few times, but played 86% of the snaps, some rotation in there. Had one of his best seasons being AP1 at slot corner. Targeted more frequently than he had been, 87 and 640 coverage snaps, but not successfully at 6.3 yards per target. So a fine year. Penalties a little bit of a problem. 11 penalties on the season with 8 first downs, 114 total yards. Not ideal, but I thought one of Marlon's best seasons.
I agree. Marlon was absolutely incredible in so many different ways. And the thing, Ken, that I thought really jumped off with Marlon, not just from an on-field perspective, but I thought he took a huge step as a leader this year, really coming into his own, calling out guys and getting on guys to be great, not in a toxic way. He wasn't a toxic call out guy, but he was like, hey, this is what it is. He was very real this season. And I thought that translated to his play on the field. And especially when you look at Marlon and kind of the reputation of like, oh, he's not really an interception guy. He's not someone that forces those turnovers through the air. We know, fruit punch Marlo on the ground, but even that was a little rare over the course of the last handful of seasons. But he comes back this season, doubles his career high in interceptions. He has 6 of them. He has his first ever pick 6. And that's been something that a lot of people in Baltimore have been like, okay, is that ever who Marlon is? Or is it just going to be super physical corner, but not a high turnover guy outside of the big fumble year? And that was a big part of why the Ravens defense was so successful, because they were able to generate those turnover plays, not just turnover plays, but Marlon had multiple key turnovers that flipped the script of games. The Cincinnati one was huge. He was a super clutch player for them this season. And I know that, you're not going to put that on the stat sheet in terms of clutch or not, but it was massive.
Yeah, the Tampa Bay interception was another very big one at that point in the game. But Marlon showed something in terms of off-man skills that you really rarely see in a corner. Jimmy Smith had a little bit of it. The more the field gets condensed, the better chances you have for this. It's often in the red zones. They're very high leverage interceptions when they occur. But when you can switch to somebody else's man and make the pick, that's really something special. You just read the quarterback, despite the fact you're in usually man coverage, or at least in a zone coverage in a different spot, and you see that. I'm incredibly impressed with that. And the Tampa Bay interception was one of the real obvious ones of that variety.
I 100% agree. I know there were a lot of conversations about maybe would Marlon's last year be coming up, what his future was like in Baltimore. And almost the conversation is flipped, because everybody wanted Brandon Stevens sign an extension, say, okay, get Brandon under contract as soon as he can. Marlon might be on the way out. Here we are right before February talking about how Marlon needs that extension and Brandon's going to be the guy on the way out.
Yeah, well, I think Brandon's on the way out. I think the question for me really came down to 2 longtime Ravens, and the Ravens can really only afford one of them. And that's Marlon Humphrey, who I think they will re-sign, and Mark Andrews, who I think they're going to have to make a move on. I would predict it's too much of a position of strength. It's too much of a surplus of talent for them not to make a change there. I expect them to try and get younger and unravel a group where all 3 contracts are coming due at the same time, which is that's a real problem. And you got to manage a franchise looking ahead for multiple years. And if you want 2026 to be a successful year, draft your next tight end right now, have Isaiah likely resign for that year. And then you can decide what to do with Charlie Kolar, whether it's going to work out for an additional year or not, or additional time or not. But you've got to manage the franchise to not have all those contracts come due at the same time.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the big thing with that, just very quickly, is with Mark and Isaiah, this is the last year they're going to be together, Max, if Mark does come back.
Yep.
There's no question. It's almost like with the middle linebacker spot you had with Roquan and Patrick Queen. They had to choose between Roquan and Patrick Queen. They chose Roquan. You just can't afford. It's not a luxury position. It's not a prime positional need. You have enough, and the Ravens are very successful drafting tight ends. It's not like they found Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely, and those have been their only franchise hits at the position. They're very good at finding that position. I feel confident in them drafting another mid-round guy that works out. It'd be a tough thing to lose Mark, but you can't keep everybody, and that's the reality Baltimore has to face.
Getting back to Humphrey for a second, very physical presence at slot corner. Really not that dissimilar to Hamilton. So you lose Hamilton, you send him to the back end. You still have a really good pass rusher in Humphrey. They used him a lot for that this year. He was very effective. Great downhill player against the run, against the pass. Doesn't quite shed blocks the way that Hamilton does. If you want to be the best horizontal defender in the NFL, Hamilton's still the ace of trumps in that regard, and Humphrey's king of diamonds or something. He's very good and a better physical presence than the Ravens deserve to have at slot, and certainly they ended up with an all-pro out of the deal. The other thing about Humphrey that I really like, I think we saw this year for the first time that he really sees the field like a safety. Now he had some other man ability he'd shown before then, but he looks like he will be converted to safety on his next contract. Would be the way. Now he's got 2 years under contract now. I'm sure the Ravens will add maybe 2 years to that, and try and spread out the cap in a way that makes more sense. Maybe with void years as well to try and make it more digestible. But Marlon is a guy I believe on this next contract we'll see the move to safety, and we'll see probably a lot of value from him at that position.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I know they tried it with Jimmy Smith, who you said had some of those abilities that we saw from Marlon this past season. I know that didn't necessarily work all that well. That wasn't really a thing, but we've seen successful corners who have long careers take that trip to safety over the last 3-4 years of their NFL life. And it works for them because as Marlon has evolved, so has his ability to see the entire field, like you talked about. I 100% agree. So I would think that the Ravens, now it then comes down to, I guess, contractually, if that is the plan, being paid like a corner or being paid like a safety, it does come down to that. And I'm sure that's something that is just a whole different realm of conversation. But I think it would be a very nice luxury, especially with Hamilton, and I think that would help his ability to move around the field and not feel as trapped into playing him in the back. And again, this past year was a very unique set of circumstances as to why they had to make all those moves. But Marlon's a good player for them, and I'm really glad this is the direction it went instead of the other one.
Yeah, happy to see it. Hope he makes that move. I've asked him the question before. He said the conversations had not yet happened, but he saw himself finishing his career at safety. So that's a lot of corners say that, especially a lot of physical corners. And that's where it really broke down for Jimmy Smith. Jimmy Smith was a big corner, but he wasn't really a physical guy, and not the guy you really want on the back end. Marlon completely meets the standard for that. All right, let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about Nate Wiggins. 65% of the snaps as a rookie, by the way. That's a big over in terms of expectation, even for number 130 overall. That's fantastic. But his playing time also increased as the season progressed. Matter of rotation, he stayed healthy. He was a solid starter in the nickel initially, rotationally, and then to an every down nickel player towards the end of the season. And really more than you could have expected in his rookie year, especially when you look at the results in terms of per play productivity.
Yeah, and that's what they needed. They needed Nate, and we talked about it earlier. It's just I don't know where they would be without Nate on the level he was playing at this season. And I think a big part for him is, again, those concerns about his makeup and his build. I think he said he added about 9 or 10 pounds over the course of the year, if I'm remembering it correctly. And I think obviously the goal is to get him playing up to a larger weight because we know the Ravens do like those physical corners, and Nate is never going to have that Marlon Humphrey build or anything like that. And obviously his speed is his calling card, which I thought he used to his advantage a lot this year. There were some moments where Nate looked like a rookie. There were some moments where I don't think he necessarily trusted what was going on behind him at times, and that led to either penalties or, bad moments, but that's every rookie. I'm not going to dock Nate for that. I mean, his year was incredible. He showed that he's going to be a long-term fixture if this route continues for him, and that he and Marlon, at least until Marlon moves to safety, can be a big corner duo for them for the next couple of seasons.
So 7.0 yards per target, a 64.6 passer rating against, which is fourth best in the NFL among cornerbacks with 50% of snaps. A lot of people probably don't know that, just how well Wiggins played. The 8 penalties were a little bit of a problem. The big step back from Clemson, by the way, and definitely introduction to the NFL here. I think if I had to say, I don't know if it's what's going on behind him. I think it's a lack of trust in his makeup speed at the pro level. It's just feeling a different level of pressure. Obviously very comfortable in college with that, and only had 1 penalty in his final season at Clemson.
Yeah, and it's a big deal that he was able to come in and do what he was able to do, because with the way that Baltimore runs their system and the way they like to rotate guys in and out, there was always going to be a question of, like, depending on how these guys performed, would Nate even play a lot this season? It wasn't that he was never going to play, but if Brandon had the year that many were expecting, if Marlon took that step, which we saw, Millette obviously being out and them having to move guys in and out, figured to increase that playing time. But still, to me, he's a guy that has so much more potential added on to this. I think this was such a big step ahead of what everybody saw for Nate in his rookie season. And now the expectation in year 2 is like, okay, can he take that jump and maybe be a Pro Bowl player next season, especially if he can fill out a little bit more?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about kind of what the floor is now. You got a much better look at what his floor is, but I don't think we know his ceiling yet. You talked a little bit about him adding weight, but still got a very elfin build, very physical in the run game though, and also coming downhill on passes. I saw much more physicality than I expected. I think that's also been true of Emmanuel Forbes. It hasn't worked out for him as well, obviously, in terms of coverage, in terms of what he's done, but really impressed with that physicality. Also impressed with his hands on the football. And he got his hand. You could be pissed off about all the dropped interceptions, and it's not improper to be that, but he probably had about 3.5 to 4.5 expected picks this year. Based on the number of times he got his hands in the football, and what is, maybe had a 70% chance on one, 80% chance on another kind of thing. He really did an outstanding job of anticipating the throw.
Yeah, and I he had multiple big plays this year. The CD fumble was massive that he was able to force. The Cowboys were driving. We're probably going to score on that drive, and that flips the game. And that Cowboys game, he definitely had some rough moments against CD, but at the end of the day, he got the last laugh there with that turnover, and he didn't look like a rookie, especially against number 1 wide receivers. It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows in that regard. But another great number 1 and rookie and Malik Neighbors and the Giants, obviously those sequence of plays in the red zone got a lot of people's attention. And I love that Nate plays with that swagger to him and that confidence level where he knows he's good and he knows he's an NFL player, and he's going to let you know about it. And I think that Ravens team, they like to play with a lot of swagger. He fit right in. That was back when he turned that on this season. He was always that player in Clemson. I think it kind of goes hand in hand with what you were saying, where he had that confidence in his ability last year, which maybe fell off a bit as we progressed through his rookie season. But I think that there's nothing to say about Nate in a negative light outside of those dropped interceptions, because for what you could expect out of a rookie, especially as that playing time increased and his role changed a little bit, I think he handled it all really well. And as you talked about, he backed it up on the field 1,000%. You're muted. Ken, you're muted.
Want to read this. This is from the Expectations series I did in the off season. But I always said a good and a great level. The idea is a good level is a 60th percentile of where I think he might be, and a great is the 80th percentile. But see what you think of Wiggins here. Great, plays above the league average, and demands a full-time role by midseason. 700 plus snaps, 16 plus games. Presence allows the Ravens to deploy Humphrey as most needed. Outside cornerback, slot cornerback, or safety. Ball production, recovery speed, and penalty avoidance, you get them all right, are similar to that at Clemson. Sticky play forces lots of altered throws from interception-leery quarterbacks. star in the making, who projects as the Ravens starter for 2025 to 28 and will compete for postseason honors over that period. Do you think we got pretty much all of that? In fact, we got more than 100% in some categories. We didn't quite get it in the penalty department.
Yeah, outside of the penalties, I think this is pretty spot on. And obviously for Marlon and his deployments, as we've mentioned throughout the entirety of this show, there was other expectations, but that Nate being Nate didn't force them into a dire, desperate situation with Marlon, where they would have had to figure out some crazy role. And especially if Nate had shown some rookie struggles or clearly wasn't ready to take that next step, maybe a bigger acquisition than Trey White would have had to happen at the deadline, which forces them to move off of a pick maybe they don't want to move off of, or they have to go bargain bin hunting free agency wise. But Nate being as good as he was, I think gave Zach Orr, John Harbaugh, and that staff a lot of confidence that only a Trey White was needed, despite Brandon Stephens having the year that he had.
Yeah, it could have legitimately meant a lot of snaps for a player like Desmond King if you end up with that. So there were people. Let's talk about Stephens a little bit. He led the cornerbacks with 92% of the snaps still. The fifth most targeted quarterback in the NFL, allowing 8.4 yards per target. Still the physical presence. I want to find some nice things to say about Brandon Stephens from this season. I think the one thing I can say is, at least for most of the season, he was not allowing really big throws over the top. Most of the throws were coming back for the football with him reacting too slowly to it. So at least there was that in terms of his play.
Yeah, I agree. And I know that, and we talk about this all the time, where pass rush and secondary go hand in hand. And when a receiver runs his route and Stephens has that clamped up, and then all of a sudden the pass rush doesn't get there and that guy's able to work back for the football, and Stephens either loses his guy or can't find the football, that contributed to some of that. And again, as I talk about, I don't think Stephens is a bad player. I just don't think it worked to the way that it needed to for them. And his strengths are strong, but his weaknesses are so glaring. And it's right there in front of you that obviously teams will go and pick on that, because it's such an easy thing to pick on. If you can't find the football, quarterbacks, veteran quarterbacks, particularly veteran wide receivers, they know how to exploit that over and over and over again. So it's something that he's needed to work on. And again, I do want to give him a little bit of grace, because we know that Stephens was a converted running back in college. The Ravens kind of moved him around over the course of his first couple of years, safety to corner, safety. They finally found him a home at corner, and it's worked. But he's still a player. I mean, when it comes down to the Ravens winning Super Bowls, is Brandon Stephens the right corner to have on this roster, as opposed to a more seasoned player that knows how to locate the football? Obviously, I'm probably taking the latter in that case.
It did seem like he was that guy last year, or certainly could be. His end of the season play was not great, but he generally speaking, last year worked fine within that system. This year, it just wasn't as good. And again, Stephens, every other quarterback knows exactly where he's going to be when they go into the huddle to call that play, and every offensive coordinator knows exactly how to scheme that up. So it becomes a big problem. He's penalized 7 times. He had that huge and very questionable call that lost the Las Vegas game in week 2. It put the Ravens at a big hole that they, remarkably dug themselves out of very well over the course of the rest of the season. We mentioned that the miscommunication on the Hamilton on the Steelers touchdown pass that went to Van Jefferson. I don't see a path back to the Ravens in 2025 for him. I'm trying to think of a way he could go to the market. The Ravens probably give him kind of a minimal offer to say, well, at least make sure you get this. And then, hopefully you work him up 10 million more than this in terms of what somebody else is willing to pay, because the Ravens are looking for comp picks in the future. But maybe there's a way he comes back on a 1-year prove it deal under some conditions, because Ravens are thin at corner and they have a bunch of players leaving.
They have the option to do it. If the price is right, you're not going to go and pay Brandon Stephens even the value that he was at before this season. He has certainly lost himself a lot of money with the year he had. But then I think it also comes down to role, because I feel like for Brandon, does he become the 4th corner if the Ravens bring somebody? If they go and they decide they want to draft a corner before the end of day 2, let's just say that, before the end of day 2, and that player shows out in training camp and he leaps Brandon Stephens, do we have another situation where all of a sudden the Ravens say, Brandon Stephens, this is going to be your role, and then a rookie surpasses him, and all of a sudden it's like, well, now Brandon Stephens isn't happy, and you're in the same situation you were with some of these other players, a la Eddie Jackson? And I just don't see a way for the money and the role to pair with the play to have it work. Now, I wouldn't be shocked, because I've said, like, we've seen who Brandon can be. And maybe it's just because, as the season goes on, there's just that it's in the air where it's going to be, well, Marlon's not going to get picked on. They're not going to throw over his way. Nate's having a great season. And, they're probably not going to try to test him a ton.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be me. And then that's kind of hanging over your head. That's a cloud. And I think that maybe is part of the reason why, because he knew it was coming. And maybe that put some pressure on him. And I think that was tough.
Not a great way of responding and changing and adapting during the year, but the Ravens frankly bear some of that blame. I think that the onus was on them after he played poorly for a long time early in the season to move him to safety as part of that solution, and they didn't do it. And that would have freed them up to have Wiggins and Humphrey on the outside, Hamilton still in the slot, have a back end that I think could have worked. And then we saw when they had injuries, and it wasn't for a whole lot of plays. So he might have only played 10 to 15 snaps on the back end in this way. But Stevens was the next guy up at safety. Right. So they put him in when, they have Hamilton out for a play or two or whatever the case may be. So if he's your backup plan, why can't you make him your primary plan? And the only thing I can come up with is that Stevens really said he didn't want to do it because it was a contract year and this and that and whatnot. Honestly, if you're Brandon Stevens, you better see the handwriting on the wall at some point. And you better say, okay, I need to salvage what I can of my future here. Find some value playing at safety. Hopefully the defense turns it around when that happens, and I'll get some of the credit for it. But I don't think it made sense for him to keep beating his head against the wall with the same skill set he had trying to cover receivers who knew exactly how to beat that.
And if that was the case, I feel like that's a foolish mindset for Brandon to have, particularly when it comes to the NFL being such a versatility-driven league these days, to have versatility at both corner and safety to at least showcase that. And, I mean, it didn't really work if he did say, I don't want to do that, I want to stick at corner, because the corner play didn't inspire. Like, if I'm a team looking for a free agent corner that's maybe going to be a mid-level market player in terms of what you have to give up asset-wise and money-wise, if you see the struggles Brandon had late in the season, that's not going to inspire me. Whereas to where at safety, I feel like the fit would have been better. And again, it worked with Ardarius. Ardarius filled in. It was great. It was fine. Yep. But you mentioned it, where even Ardarius left for a couple of plays in that Buffalo game, and it was Brandon Stevens who moved to safety. So it wasn't like Stevens was fourth on that depth chart in terms of backup options. They clearly were like, okay, if someone goes down, you're going to be the next one up. I would have been curious, even if it wasn't a split, to see how it would have worked, because maybe it could have helped him increase his value. But instead, I think it's tough to watch a guy's value just crater over the course of the season. And that's what we saw happen.
Really a poster child for signing early for divisible benefits. In some ways, it's good that the Ravens occasionally have one of this, even though it's very costly to the Ravens in terms of a comp pick they might get on Stevens. It's hard to turn that lemon into lemonade, but it is a case where if other players see it, and there's a whole bunch of third-year players on the Ravens now just finishing up who are at the point Stevens was last year in terms of signing an early deal, they may look at Brandon Stevens as a cautionary tale and say, okay, you know what? I'll take that money you're offering, Ravens. And Ardarius Washington, Daniel Faalele is in this case right now. I think he'd be highly incented to sign a deal earlier. And then even some of the players who will command big contracts next year, like Linderbaum, likely Travis Jones, and Hamilton, would even they may look at it and say, yeah, I don't want to have that happen to me and have all my value so highly leveraged into how I perform in 2025. So hopefully the Ravens get some value out of that.
Yeah, it'll be a big contract situation as well, because it's not just as simple as a guy losing value if they were offered a contract, let's say, before the year started, and then all of a sudden they have a bad year and they're like, okay, you're right. Like I'll sign for that money that was offered. One, that deal's probably off the table. And two, the Ravens are probably like, well, actually, you don't really fit our long-term vision anymore. Right. You did last offseason, but times and situations and circumstances have changed. So I agree. For guys like Travis Jones, Isaiah Likely, I know that Hamilton and Linderbaum they'll get their big money deal, and that'll be that. They will probably reset the market of both of their positions. But I think the Ravens could use Stevens as a might want to take the money because it's not going to be all sunshine and rainbows all the time. There's no guarantee that you continue to increase your value.
Yeah, the guarantee is right here in this contract. So yeah,
exactly.
Let's move on. Trey White acquired in exchange for an exchange of 7th round picks. So a 7th round pick in 26 for a 7th round pick in 27. Neither of those has any value. So the Rams obviously unloading Trey White for nothing. He had played very poorly for them, 11.6 yards per target, 147.8 passer rating against him while he's with the Rams. Not dissimilar to another cornerback 5 years earlier in acquired also from the Rams and Marcus Peters. But came in, played right cornerback rotationally, played in dime packages down the stretch, but also rotationally. And he was always at right corner and made an immediate impact and covered from a coverage perspective had a very good year.
Yeah, and this could have been a situation where, because Trey White, I think he had 4 straight healthy scratches from the Rams prior to being traded. It was clear that they were going to cut him if no deal was come to with a team, and the Ravens essentially just cut the line in terms of him going on waivers after the deadline and saying, we'll take him, we'll give you nothing, give us nothing, and here we go. And I think that for Baltimore, having him in that locker room was good. He obviously, despite his play falling off due to the injuries that he suffered in Buffalo, still is very much so one of the best locker room guys in the league, according to a lot of different people. He brings that stable veteran presence. And it is the opposite of what we saw with Brandon Stevens, where I think he did increase his value to the point where teams might look at what he did in Baltimore and that steady, solid veteran presence on and off the field and say, maybe we'll throw a couple $1 million per year on maybe a 2-year contract to Trey White. And the Ravens, I feel like they would maybe want to bring him back in some capacity, but if it gets too expensive, and I don't think it's going to be like, okay, he's going to sign a 3-year, $30 million contract, but if it gets too expensive, they might have to say it was great, it was awesome, but there are other things they have to do. Maybe it has a situation to go with Mark Andrews. Like maybe they can restructure that contract and fit a deal or two in, but it's going to be interesting to see how they navigate because he was actually a much better addition. I thought it was going to be a very much so he's not going to make an impact at all, but all of a sudden he became actually a pretty solid guy for them.
Yeah, definitely 6.1 yards per target. It was only 18 targets, but that Pittsburgh game came in immediately, had 2 passes defense, one of them in the end zone against Pickens, was really pretty darn sweet when you get right down to it. A stark contrast when the ball is in the air to what was happening with Stevens, obviously.
And that called for a lot of people saying that it should be Trey White at that spot. And obviously with what we were talking about, maybe that is moving Brandon Stevens into safety and you can have that flexibility with Hamilton. Never really worked out that way. There were moments where Trey White got those opportunities and Brandon Stevens was out for a series or something, but never really came to fruition fully.
They did play a lot of dime down the stretch. And when they were in dime, White was at right corner and Stevens was inside at weak side linebacker in that dime back position. So Stevens had multiple chances to show his value there. I thought his physicality was pretty good on the inside too. Would be another nice thing to say about Brandon there. Let's move on and talk about Arthur Maulet, though. Played only 72 snaps. He has had a very solid 2023. I didn't think he was spectacular, but he was a guy who I was not terribly upset at the contract the Ravens gave him, which was 2 years for about $4.5 million, $4 million, something like that. He's got $2.25 million of savings if they cut him in 25, which I anticipate will happen.
He's one of the more likely cap casualties to happen over the course of that. I know there are like a couple you could make an argument for, but it just feels like the Ravens found something without him and that they have the ability to add on to that, whether it be through free agency, the draft, or trades, to where I don't think he's necessary to bring back. I think at the time, we were talking about, would it be Darby? Would it be Maulet? I think we assumed they would bring back one, but not both of those guys. Maulet did seem like the more likely option, even though at the time, I think I definitely would have preferred Darby. Now, hindsight is 2020, and we talked about it. Darby did not have a good year, but it was really a wash for both guys because now I think you can go and find another player to replace Arthur Maulet, and even could be an undrafted guy that you get a lot of the savings with, where you get maybe what's the 80% of the play for 20% or
20% of the
whatever it
price.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe we're in that situation with Arthur Millette.
A slot corner is a good position where if your scouting is good, particularly if you're like a small school guy or whatever, you can definitely find a player there. The Ravens don't generally invest a lot of their opportunity cost for camp in slot corners, but they know who they are in the league and they can go pick them off somebody else's practice squad if they want to. But most of their guys that they bring into camp are going to be the humongous aircraft carrier outside corners. Those guys are much rarer. And it's like investing in starting pitchers as opposed to investing in relievers. You're doing your organization much more use investing in those outside corners. They'll go into the length. All right, let's move on. Jalen Armour-Davis, very disappointing time with the Ravens so far. Obviously, highly praised by Harbaugh about his level of play in camp. I got to say, he's looking at different practices than I am. I was there every day. I missed 3 practices the whole camp time, and he just could not find the football in the air. He's got Brandon Stevens-itis in terms of that. He's got good speed. So does Brandon. He ends up playing 94 snaps on the year. And despite the fact that the secondary thinned out, he never seriously contested for a rotational role. He did very briefly play some rotationally for the Ravens middle of the year, but didn't hold up in that role.
Yeah, I guess during those 3 practices you missed, he was Deion Sanders, and that came down to where all those great words came from.
Yeah, I have to ask Jonas Schaefer or somebody about that. So he had 6 interceptions yesterday, I guess.
Yeah, right. Yeah, crazy. But you're right. I think the telling thing was that despite all that the Ravens went through in the secondary this year, we never really heard his name, and he was on IR for a little bit, suffered through some injuries, and that cost him some time this season. But it seems like we go through this every year with Jalen Armour-Davis, where he gets injured or he can't track the ball. Like you said, it feels like the Ravens either have great ball tracking players or they can't do it at all. And it's such a weakness in their game. I wouldn't be shocked if he's cut during training camp next year or after training camp happens next year. Feels like it's been the same story. And they're going to probably bring in a couple of players to compete. Plus the fact that you already have a lot of guys that can do a lot of the things that Jalen Armour-Davis already can do. I just don't see a clear pathway to a role for him in 2025, especially even if he has another good camp, according to John Harbaugh. Like, I just don't see it.
So I think there'll be some open competition components to this, but some of it depends on tenure. And as a 4th-year player, there's no sand left in the hourglass after 2025 for Jalen Armour-Davis. They don't own any of his future. They do own 3 years of TJ Tampa's future. So he's got to be a much higher priority in terms of figuring out what he can do on the football field. And then they're going to draft a corner. They may have an undrafted guy they like. And Armour-Davis actually in a pretty good position that Millette, White, and Stevens may all be going. And that leaves the room very thin, by the way. Humphrey, Wiggins, Jalen Armour-Davis, and Tampa will be all that are left. So there'll be a draft pick there. They might have an undrafted guy they like, and whether or not he hangs on as the 5th corner really is very much up in the air. And I think that's his best hope, is to be the number 5 guy with the Ravens next year.
I would probably say it depends on how much they invest, if at all, in free agency. If they truly do bring in a top level guy, which I personally don't think will happen as well. But like,
it could be White, maybe.
Yeah, it could happen. But then if it is White and you add a draft pick, and then let's say there's an undrafted guy, then there's no way that he sticks around.
Yeah, completely agree. All right, let's move on to TJ Tampa. 18 snaps of mop-up duty was all he had this season, which is unfortunate. Falls well short of your hope for a rookie 4th-rounder. So Wiggins way over, Tampa is well under. Anthony Averett, I believe in his rookie season, had about 65 snaps. I'd have to look at this. I've quoted that number several times. So I'm actually wrong about it. It's bad. I should actually go back, look it up, and be right. But Anthony Averett, a 4th-round pick, ended up being a starting corner. You'd love for TJ Tampa to get that kind of exposure in his rookie year. The good thing is he's a 4-unit special teams player, and he's been good. So hasn't missed a bunch of tackles. He's made a few and played 170 special team snaps across 9 games. So I can't be completely down on his rookie year. And I think the Ravens, they would have had difficulty having him have a trial by fire had it come to that this year.
Yeah, and one of the things that, honestly, when it comes to those mid to late round picks we saw for Baltimore in the 2024 draft, was they came out of it with a couple of really good special teams guys. I know this is bleeding into safety a little bit, but Sanusi Kane might be the new Anthony Levine with how he played and everything that he was able to do. Both those guys in Tampa was disappointing because he had injuries as well he had to deal with, and he was on IR for a little bit too. So not really a ton of opportunity to get into a rhythm. And when the secondary is going through all of that turmoil and trying to figure out who's playing where, it didn't shock me he didn't get a ton of opportunities. But I think next year is going to be a big year to development because he could be another player that if a guy goes down, him having experience could help. But considering the player that he was coming out of school, I know, Ken, you and I were both very high on him during the draft process. And I remember being on the stream with you. We were thrilled when that ended up being the pick, someone that we both had targeted with that selection, not really knowing why he fell. It could be a big year, but it would probably have to come if another one of those Ravens top corners got injured or struggled the way that Brandon Stephens did, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, he could get it some rotational play, but admittedly, it's almost like he's starting over again this next year, looking to get some playing time that would be at a level like that. The only other guy, Desmond King, played a few snaps for the Ravens. Not obviously a factor. Probably not a factor for 2025, but you never know. I mean, he's a guy who versatile special teams player, could be a guy that the Ravens certainly at least give a chance shot to in camp.
It's possible. I wouldn't be shocked if he's back for training camp. And this is a bigger conversation, but the Ravens need to figure it out at punt returner. It's been very bad for them recently in terms of not finding a consistent guy there, really since Jacoby left. And it's been tough. I mean, they've had moments with players like Cyrus Jones and some other players that have come in for a year and been fine. But Desmond King had those, he had a couple of actually pretty solid returns for them. But then obviously the ball security issues definitely didn't help when it came to getting out of that John Harbaugh doghouse or avoiding the John Harbaugh doghouse, because we know how that can go. So is a slot guy, maybe a training camp body. If he has a good training camp or returner, maybe that's where his spot comes in, because obviously the Deontay Hardy signing also did not work out for them. And they just need to figure that out. But I'm not necessarily projecting him. Maybe he's a veteran practice squad player and they have him there next season. And that's where he can get called up for a game or two if they need him.
Yeah. And that's a great spot for him. But he is a player who could provide you enough to justify a special teams spot. So if he's a good special teams player, including covering kicks and being a 4-unit guy with returns on 2, probably in terms of a kick, either kick or punt, then he has enough value if he can also play some defense as well. And that's where the Ravens' great special teams players have all come from. It's, Anthony Levine, what made him special is he could get on the field and be a hell of a dime back. Albert McClellan, he could play a lot of different positions on defense. At one game, he started at right defensive end for the Ravens when Suggs was out. So the Ravens' best special teams players are the guys who can also contribute something on offensive defense. Malik Harrison right now, Chris Board right now, in terms of what they do. So hopefully King can be that guy and not just a return specialist, because I don't think that's enough of a role for the Ravens to keep him around.
I agree.
Let's talk about 2025 needs now. They certainly need to get younger via the draft, replace the 3 departures of Stevens, Mollett, and JD. They have a lot of picks this year. Would you project 1 or 2 corners?
I would say probably 1 corner with them signing high priority undrafted free agents at that position. That's probably where I would go. I don't think that it's their biggest need. I don't think that a first, if the right player's there, sure. But I feel like by the end of day 2, they will probably have 1. And whether that is night 1 or day 2 remains to be seen. But I think you bring in someone who can compete immediately, a high-level profile player, and then you can maybe find a slot guy in undrafted free agency. So 1 actual draft pick, but they also have 11. So I wouldn't be shocked if they use one of those very late selections on a corner, get that rookie contract in, and then move from there.
Right. They've done that a fair number of times with players like Kennedy and others who they get some late round value out of too. Draft priority, obviously not as high as offensive tackle. A lot of people want to see an edge drafted. I do too. I mean, Ajabo looks like he's on his way out. Probably they need to see what Adisa Isaac has, but I think another edge is definitely probably pretty important for this team. But I still think corner, given the number of defections, is high, and other interior offensive line. I mean, they last year may seem like a calm sea relative to what this year looks like in terms of defections from the offensive line if they don't sign anybody. So if Stanley, McCary, Jones, and Cleveland all go, I mean, that's a lot of their offensive line depth they'll have to replace, and they're going to have to scramble to figure out the pieces. And I would not be shocked if this is a year where they drafted 3 offensive linemen among their selections.
Yeah, I think 2 at a very absolute minimum, if not 3. It makes the most
tackle,
sense.
1 interior.
Yeah, I'm not expecting Cleveland to be back. I think they might have a spot for Josh Jones just as a depth piece. McCary and Stanley are both interesting conversations. You could argue both for or against, but we know the Ravens are a BPA team unless they have a very drastic need, but they don't like to ever force. And I think that's the right strategy. You don't want to force a second round grade on a day one because there's no one else available at that position. So they will find guys that they like, whether that is a corner or an offensive lineman, whether it be a guard or a tackle, but they're going to need to prioritize because the offensive line situation, it was always going to be a multi-year retooling of that position. You lose 3 starters last year. You might lose 2 more this season, which is going to be a big shift in what we saw. But relative to it, it's not like they're going to force a 3rd round grade offensive tackle in the 1st round. If there's a corner that should have gone top 15, they're going to take that guy at 27.
I agree. I do think that offensive tackle of all positions is a position you have to reach for to get value in the draft. And
Agree.
Whether people think it or not, because it worked out so well, Rosengarten was a big reach at 62. So I know people don't really completely believe that, and now that the evidence is on the side that he's played pretty well with a lot of help, but they had to reach a little bit. And I think they were thinking of even reaching further, from what I've heard, that the Chiefs might have wanted to hop in front of them and couldn't quite make it work for themselves. Let's get back to corner though. Chuck Pagano comes in. What do you expect to see different about this unit in terms of 2025 with him leading it?
I would, excuse me, I would probably expect to see just a little bit more in terms of their rotations figuring out. I also think moving guys around is something that they're going to have that serious conversation about. And I honestly think that this could be the year that they do that. And I think Pagano might be one to recommend because talking about the Ravens and kind of hearing him keep up with them over the course of this past season, he obviously believes in what they do. First of all, he was very clear about that. He had a lot of praise for the way that they turned it around, but I'm going to be curious to see what they end up doing with their safety rotations, whether they want to continue to work with Ardarius there, which I think will be the ultimate solution. I think they're not going to move off of Ardarius after the year that he had, but whether it is, and again, I'm not saying Revis Island, you don't have to move a guy with a receiver for the entire course of a game, but even if Stevens leaves, just matching up a little bit better there, because if there's a clear weakness, teams will take advantage of it. And we saw that happen more often than not with the Ravens, and it cost them games in some situations. So that to me will be the biggest thing. And then obviously with the way that they round out their team with the depth pieces at corner, maybe replacing Stevens and at safety, I'm going to be curious to see how Pagano has his imprint, because now with Hewitt gone, Pagano's going to have a little bit of free reign here to put some things back in. And that defense he had in 2011 was incredible. It was unbelievable before he went on to Indianapolis. He was a top 5 unit in both run defense and pass defense. They were top 3 scoring defense. So it's a good hire to me. And I think maybe we'll bring back some of the stuff that we saw all those years ago in Baltimore.
I think we'll continue to see the too high shell be the starting point, and that's not entirely his decision. How to rotate out of it, how to solve that for his guys is another matter. But Pagano's a good voice for the secondary too. I mean, to the degree Orr wants something that's not realistic out of the safeties, Pagano is a good person to tell that to him. Dean Pease is also not a bad guy, but Pagano will be a good guy to basically respond to that and say, hey, look, we're asking too much of our safeties on this. We got to at least allow X and Y and Z, and that could be a good way to do it. But I do expect a similar look. I expect them to basically maintain a lot of their organizational DNA with wanting to stay with an initial 2 deep look.
Yeah, and part of the reason he was brought back and the reason it worked out was because he is so familiar with what they do and what their philosophies are. So I'm not expecting Pagano to come in there and just change everything that Chris Hewitt had or that the defense has. There's going to be that same structure, probably just with a couple different new wrinkles that honestly could end up paying big dividends.
All right. Always great talking football with you, Kevin. Tell folks where they can find your work online.
Yeah, always appreciate you having me on, Ken. You can find me over at the Locked On Ravens podcast. We talk about Ravens football 5 days per week, every weekday. We also have some bonus episodes on the weekend when some big news happens or some other stuff goes down. We go live after every game, which unfortunately we won't be doing that for a little while here. But you can also find me over at the Ravens Wire, where I do my written content. I do some work over at Bleacher Report, and I also do some work covering Orioles, Ravens, and Baltimore sports with the Ryan Ripken Show.
All right. Outstanding. Kevin, thanks for coming on again. Other folks out there, this is the time for you to do your film study shorts during the off season. I want to hear your ideas for an episode. Already got 4 or 5 of them via email. And the big one coming up is a discussion over whether or not it's time to end John Harbaugh's tenure in Baltimore. People know my feelings about that fact. I'm one of the strongest Harbaugh supporters there is out there, but I want to have an open discussion about this. I want people to be on a panel, address questions on this, to talk through strengths and weaknesses and try and relativize those things. And if you're up to that, and particularly if you are pro-fire Harbaugh, I need you for this show. I have lots of people who basically want to defend Harbaugh. It's an easier kind of group to get for some reason. There are a million of you out there online, or at least there's a large vocal minority of you out online saying John Harbaugh's got to be fired every week. If you want to really put together your thoughts and come up with a pros and cons list, I want to hear from you. Please DM me on Twitter and I'll get right back to you. Kevin, thanks again for coming on.
Absolutely, Ken. Always appreciate you.
And we'll talk to you next time on Film Study.